So this video is going to discuss joints. We're going to first describe what joints are, and then we're going to talk about the different types of joints that we have in our bodies. So to begin, what exactly are joints? So joints are also known as articulations. And so these are actually the points at which two bones are going to meet. Okay? And so in our body, we have three types of joints that we can characterize structurally. So we're going to talk about the structural classification. And what this means is how do these types of joints differ in terms of structure or anatomy? And the first type of structural classification of joints is what we call the fibrous. Okay. Now, when we say a fibrous joint, this means that the bones at that articulation site or at that joint are bound together by collagen fibers. So collagen fibers join the bones. So there are three types of fibrous joints. The first one is what we call a suture. And if you remember from the skeletal system, when we were studying the skull, we looked at several sutures that join together the cranial bones. And so typically a suture is what you're going to find in the skull joining the cranial bones. And so these types of joints do not have a joint cavity, so it means the bones come in real close proximity to each other, and then they are also bound together by collagen fibers. The second type of a fibrous joint is what we call a gomphosis. And this is the type of joint that you find in your mouth, and it's going to attach a tooth to its socket. And the type of collagen fibers that are going to attach the tooth to the socket is what we call the periodontal ligament. And then finally, the third type of a fibrous joint is what we call a syndesmosis. And so these types of joints are where the bones are bound together by long collagen fibers. So we're just going to say long collagen fibers attach the two bones. And then an example of this would be the shaft of the radius attaching to the shaft of the ulna. And these are the two bones of your lower arm. So now let's move on and talk about the second type of joint that we can characterize structurally, and that's going to be the cartilaginous joints. Cartilaginous joints, just from the word cartilage, you'll now know that the type of tissue that's going to join the bones is no longer collagen fibers, but instead is going to be cartilage. So here we have cartilage binds the two bones. And we have two types of cartilaginous joint. The first type is what we call a synchondrosis. And this synchondrosis, what differentiates it from the second type, which is called the symphysis, is that they have different types of cartilage binding the bones. In the synchondrosis, it's actually hyaline cartilage linking the two bones, versus in the symphysis, it's going to be fibrocartilage. So the type of cartilage binding the bones is going to determine whether it's a synchondrosis cartilaginous joint or a symphysis. And just to give you some examples of location, synchondrosis joints, one example would be at the epiphyseal plate. And this is the cartilage tissue that is located at the ends of the long bone to indicate the location of growth of the bone in length. So epiphyseal plate made up of hyaline cartilage in children, and then it ossifies as these children become adults. And then an example of a fibrocartilage joint is going to be the pubic symphysis, which is going to be the joint that links the two coxal bones anteriorly. Okay, so at the pubic region, linking the two hip bones is what we call the pubic symphysis. And another example is in between the vertebrae. All right, and then this brings us to our third and last functional or structural classification, the type of joint, and this is going to be our synovial joints. And so synovial joints are actually all the joints that you can think of in your body. If I ask you to name a joint, you're probably going to name your elbow, your knee, your hip, your shoulder joints. So all of these are examples of synovial joints. And what is so special about them is that they are very freely moving, so freely movable joints as compared to the other two. And they also have a joint cavity, meaning that the two bones, for example, in this picture here, the two bones do not touch each other. And so you have a joint cavity located in between the two bones. And so this is typical of a synovial joint. You would not see this joint cavity in the cartilaginous nor in the fibrous joints. And so some examples are going to be your knee, elbow, shoulder, and hip joint. And then there are other structures associated with the joint cavity, such as cartilage, synovial fluid, and we'll talk about that in class. Before we wrap up this video, we have one more definition to discuss, and that's going to be functional classification of these joints. So what does functional classification mean? Here, instead of talking about what they look like structurally or anatomically, we're going to look at how movable are these joints. So typically, these fibrous joints are usually immovable. Very, very limited flexibility. And so this immovable characteristic is what is known as synarthrotic or synarthroses joints, so immovable. Cartilaginous joints are typically somewhat movable. And so this is a term that we call amphiarthrotic. And finally, our synovial joints, we've already established they are freely movable. So they have the most degree of flexibility, and this is what we call diarthroses or a diarthrotic joint. Okay, so synarthrosis, amphiarthrosis, or diarthrosis can refer to how movable are these types of joints.